We'll go ahead and start with our afternoon session. I'd like to welcome Dr. Erika Ross from Abbott for Neuromodulation to the front, and she'll give a talk on your brain on electricity.
All right, thanks guys so much for the attention. This has been such a fun day already. I'm super excited that you guys are all here. So I'm Erika Ross. I head up a group of researchers at Abbott Neuromodulation. We're trying to kind of invent the next generation of neuromodulation devices. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the work we do at Abbott, as well as a bit about my career path and kind of what got me here to do what I do today. So I am a current employee and shareholder at Abbott. So I started my career really interested in these neurons. I'm a neuroscientist and molecular biologist by training, and I kicked off my research career looking at this level of detail in the nervous system. Like what are these structures? As you zoom in further, what's going on underneath those neurons at the molecular level and the cellular level to really have a functioning system and a functioning circuit. So really at the protein level, at the cellular level, what's going on with the brain and the nervous system. So I spent a lot of time characterizing what healthy looked like, what disease looked like in a molecular biology lab, and decided this was kind of the pathway I was gonna go. And so zoomed out a little bit from here, and I moved to the Mayo Clinic, where I transitioned from interest in the brain and nerves to what has strong foundations in this kind of fish here. So neuromodulation. So neuromodulation therapies actually go back to like 80 AD, where we pulled from this what's called a torpedo fish. They used to use this fish to treat headache and migraine back in ancient Greece. And so this was kind of the original neuromodulation therapy. Zooming forward a little bit, there have been a lot of different neuromodulation therapies that have been developed and taken to market in different practice areas across the board. So neuromodulation, though having strong historical anchor in ancient Greece, a lot of what we build today into these tools and treatments for patients actually is anchored in the cardiac pacemaker. So a lot of the same components there. So cardiac pacemaker came to market or it was FDA approved in 1958. After that, cochlear stimulators came to market to treat folks who were hearing impaired. So we started seeing that if you take something electrical, an exogenous electrical stimulation that you can create with an implantable medical device, you can actually change nerve function. So looking molecularly what's going on, looking at a higher level, if you stimulate these things, you can actually change circuit function. So cochlear stimulation approved in 1982, spinal cord stimulation for the first time in 1989 for chronic pain. And that's a lot of what I do at Abbott today. So a spinal cord stimulation after this was deep brain stimulation, which is approved to treat essential tremor, which is a movement disorder, as well as Parkinson's disease and a couple of other smaller markets. So different things with movement and some other neuropsychiatric disorders and so on. Sacral nerve stimulation in 1997 was approved to treat a couple additional disorders, incontinence and some other things. Vagus nerve stimulation in 1997, some cardiac disorders, some depression actually is another one that therapy treats. And finally in 2013, starting to incorporate information to create smarter therapies to treat things like epilepsy. So you look across the stuff that we've done today and you see how many different practice areas we can touch with neuromodulation therapies. We continue to learn more and more about what is possible as you interface an electrical stimulation with these different areas. So when I was at Mayo Clinic, I was studying a lot of these different therapies, mostly focused in movement disorders and memory disorders with deep brain stimulation. Talk more about deep brain stimulation later. But after I finished up my work at Mayo Clinic, I went to a company called Cala Health. And the idea behind the company, this company came out of Stanford, out of the Stanford Biodesign program. The idea behind this is very similar to the other therapies with an implanted neuromodulation therapy, where you have an electrical interface with the nervous system, where you can access these portions of the nervous system that are not functioning quite as well. So deep brain stimulation, the idea here in a disorder like essential tremor, you're targeting directly the part of the brain that is seeing this kind of pathological signal, this misfiring of neurons in that portion of the brain. The idea behind telehealth is you look to see what neurons project to that portion of the brain from somewhere else. Luckily, there's a couple nerves in your wrist that project really nicely to that portion of the brain. And so the idea that the team came up with is that we could stimulate these two nerves at a very specific pattern in patients who had hand tremors, so essential tremor and hand tremor, and see if we could also hit that same circuit and decrease that kind of pathological firing. So I'm going to show you the results from a lot of the work that we did there to create this therapy. So this is a patient who had moderate hand tremors. She came into a clinic that we had on site at this company. We gave her our original device here that was a wrist-worn neuromodulation device to stimulate those two nerves in the wrist. She wore it for 40 minutes, and at the end of that, she didn't have hand tremor anymore. You can see that this video is going because she's breathing if you watch her shirt. So pretty effective therapy as you think about neuromodulation tools and devices and how you might creatively interface with different parts of the nervous system to have a very similar effect. So I stayed at Cala was there for several years, taking this idea from clinic and from idea and from early prototypes to late prototypes to something that we submitted to the FDA, and we got it FDA approved, and we actually, the last week I was there, we sold our first device, so got it to market, so patients can now actually access this thing, which is pretty cool, pretty fun. And so I had this experience where I had seen a lot of different neuromodulation devices and neuromodulation therapies and understood which practice areas that we can currently treat with neuromodulation at the Mayo Clinic. I had this experience of taking a single device and kind of creatively hitting similar circuits to what's done with implanted neuromodulation devices and getting that from idea out onto market. And then I left Cala and I joined Abbott Neuromodulation, where I now focus back in the implanted neuromodulation space, but really trying to expand what we can do with our current therapies and future therapies for the field. So I mentioned that a lot of what we do is with chronic pain patients and that spinal cord stimulator that I showed you guys earlier. We have a couple different neuromodulation therapies at Abbott. We have this radio frequency ablation device, which is kind of like peripheral nerve stimulation, where you hit part of the circuit more peripherally and you kind of ablate that pain signal so it doesn't project to the brain. We have the spinal cord stimulator with a very specific kind of waveform that I'm not going to get into, but that electrical signal is a little bit more physiological so that the brain responds really nicely to it and you do cancel out that pain signal. And then a dorsal root ganglion stimulator, so another part of the circuit that contains a lot of sensory information about what that chronic pain experience is. So we've got this unique pain portfolio that we spend a lot of time thinking about what's out there already and how to improve it, and think about what other areas we can pull from to continue to build on this portfolio. I'm going to talk more on the deep brain stimulation side. So we have a deep brain stimulator that is built to treat Parkinson's disease and essential tremors. So similar disorder to what we were doing at Cala Health, but there are specific patients that something like a wrist-worn stimulator, you're not going to be able to hit a lot of the other symptoms that happen with Parkinson's disease with just something that's treating hand tremor. Parkinson's and a lot of other parts of essential tremor are actually very complicated. So if you're able to get into the brain and the portion of the brain that's really driving a lot of that pathological circuitry, you're going to have a higher improvement, a much better improvement compared to no treatment or something non-invasive. And so with deep brain stimulation, we've got a couple different widgets, I call them. My engineering partners hate it when I use that word, but they're widgets. that we use to treat these disorders. So we've got a couple leads. Kind of see these over here. These go into the brain. I'll talk about that in just a minute. We have an implanted pulse generator, which is the battery, as well as a lot of the other circuitry, super complicated stuff to kind of control what's going on and what's being delivered, what that output looks like, making sure all of the safety limits are working the way they need to, and so on. And then we have the ability for the patients to use their own cell phone, actually, to kind of control what that stimulation looks like, and to interface with their clinician partner here, the patient programmer here, clinician programmer there, where they can adjust therapy settings and what that stimulation output looks like. And then finally, that implanted pulse generator. So all of these pieces together kind of make up a neuromodulation therapy, and this is pretty standard across the board for other companies as well. We kind of use the same bits and pieces to treat these different chronic disorders. So with deep brain stimulation, what happens, you take this thin wire called a lead. It's put in a very specific part of the brain. So in essential tremor like I was talking about earlier, this part of the brain would be the ventral intermediate nucleus of the thalamus. That's where we put this electrode for people who have hand tremor. For Parkinson's disease, it's a couple different areas. There's this area called the STN, or the GPI. So a couple other regions that we know are related to some of the more complicated parts of Parkinson's disease. So after this lead is implanted, then it's turned on, and these mild electrical impulses are delivered through that lead to the brain to really kind of interrupt that pathological signal. So I'm going to show you a quick video of a Parkinson's patient who she doesn't have her stimulation turned on right now. So you can see how severe her tremor is and how much her body's shaking. She's got a lot of other symptoms that aren't as visual, but you can kind of see with stimulation off.
Oh my God.
How severe
I can't
this
believe
disorder
this.
is.
Hold it.
I'm gonna put it
Okay,
back
please put
on.
it back on. Oh my God.
Okay, so we're gonna start with the left body first. Turn that one on. You're back on.
You can see how
Look at
how
that.
different
This is amazing.
once that stimulation is turned on. So when that
This-
electrode is in the right part of the brain and it's turned on and tuned in the correct way, this is an extremely effective therapy for patients. So I've talked a lot about kind of the hardware and the targets, but as you guys think about future careers in neuromodulation, I want you to consider how far we've come and how far we have to go still. So we understand a lot more about the molecular basis of what's going on when you deliver electrical stimulation to nerves. We're getting pretty good at that because of the tools and the advancements that we've had in this space. I think heard a little bit about some of the imaging tools and other research tools that are coming along for us to really start to understand the neuroscience behind neuromodulation. So we used to have very few tools, just kind of structurally what do nerves look like. Now we can understand things like connectivity, like how did these things fire together, wire together, as you guys heard about earlier. We now have tools to do this. We now have the ability to miniaturize therapies. So this is the kind of the original pacemaker. This is this huge box that was externalized. And now we have the ability to have these implants that are super tiny. So these interfaces that are extremely small and much better for patients in the long run. And finally, the seed that I really want to plant with you guys as you think about careers in this space is to think about the digital tools and the digital advancements. We have come so far in software and computation and artificial intelligence, things like this, where we're really able to understand better about what's going on with patients over time and use those kind of data streams to actually fine-tune these neuromodulation therapies extremely well. So we've come from very old computational tools to extremely small and integrated computation that's now accessible to a lot of people. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks, guys, so much.
Okay, we have a question here.
At the very beginning, you mentioned this torpedo fish and how it did something to affect the brain. Like, what did they do? How did they use it?
So it's not too far off from that TMS stuff that he was talking about. Take this electrical fish, put it on the head, it stopped migraine. And so they found a tool, which was a fish that was electrical, and they used that to decrease migraine by just putting it on the part of the body that was affected.
Great. We have time for one more question.
So, how are leads put into the brain, and do they need to be replaced?
Good question. So the leads are put into the brain. It's an image-guided process. So people will take a picture of the brain, understand where those different structures are, and then a neurosurgeon will drill a hole in the skull, a very tiny hole, and then put that lead down into that portion of the brain with some really cool geometric tools that help it get to the right part of the brain. They anchor it there and tunnel down to that implanted pulse generator. Good question. And then they tend to stay there pretty well. Sometimes there are things like a lead can fracture if some accident happens, things like that. But for the most part, the leads stay put. Good question.
Great. Let's hear it for Dr. Ross.